Hello, everybody. I'm Adam Ebert, and welcome to Can I Teach It, a show that explores the teachability of pop culture across mediums. Today, we're talking about Phoebe Bridgers' album, Punisher.
This book is filled with beautiful prose. This film's third act's a bit on the nose. This album features just one hit, but can I teach it?
With me, Mr. Ebert. First off, I want to thank everybody for the positive response that you've shown my channel and our first episode on WandaVision. I think the positive response kind of reinforced a lot of my goals for this channel, but also gave me those necessary warm and fuzzies to keep me going. So with that being said, let's talk about what's next. All right, so a little context. Phoebe Bridgers, 26-year-old singer-songwriter from LA. People describe her music naturally indie folk, indie rock, and emo folk, which I think is very fitting. I would describe her music as melancholy, which is one of my favorite descriptors, but also one of my favorite genres of music, if I can classify certain artists and bands as melancholy. Even pop music like Churches or artists like St. Vincent or Leaky Lee or Rye have this kind of melancholy tone. Little background on Bridgers. First EP is Killer in 2014, finds success there. Goes on tour with Conor Oberst. 2017 is Stranger in the Alps, her first studio album, which is critically acclaimed. After that first album, she collaborates with Lucy Dacus and Julian Baker to form the group Boy Genius. After that, she also collaborates with Bright Eyes' Conor Oberst to form the Better Oblivion Community Center, which is a great name and an even better album. So that's worth checking out if you haven't. 2020, though, mid-pandemic, Bridgers releases Punisher, and it was something that she was particularly outspoken about in terms of releasing and not waiting to release. And that was the first time that I really heard of Punisher, Bridgers, and her work in general. I think it speaks to 2020 as a year that an album like Punisher resonated with me, much more so than anything poppy or uproarious or triumphant. So with that being said, let's talk about how would you teach it? Now, in considering what I choose to discuss each episode, I'm considering a bunch of things, right? I'm looking at culturally relevant texts. I'm looking at things that are contemporary, but I'm also looking at things that resonate with me. A lot of times that presents a challenge because what I'm picking maybe isn't perfect or maybe doesn't work exactly the way I want it to. When I think about this, I think this is good. I think this reflects the creative process that is teaching, that is building a curriculum. As I'm working, I'm always thinking about what can I bring into my classroom that I'm passionate about? And more importantly, how can I do that effectively? That's going to be the process behind this series. So with that, there's going to be some imperfections. There's going to be some things that don't work. And it's going to be interesting to see how those things play out. So in preparation for this episode, I think it's important to note I had to spend a great deal of time with this album. As I'm working through all of this, I made sure that I listened to the album. And then I listened to it again. And then I listened to it again, and then I listened to it again, and I listened to it again, and then I listened to it for a couple more times. And then only after that whole process that I really feel confident in not only creating this work, but also sharing it with you. All right, so for lesson plan option number 1, what I'm going to call this is double standards in media. Most certainly, I think you're going to need to start by introducing your classes to Phoebe Bridgers. Look at some interviews, talk about who she is, maybe sample some tracks from her previous albums or her collaborations with Boy Genius or Conor Oberst. What I think you can get to then is her most recent Saturday Night Live performance in which she performs I Know the End and Kyoto. And at the end of that performance, this is what she does. And a lot of people were angry about that on the internet. We saw a double standard. We saw people questioning her decisions to do that. However, one of the most famous posters in all of rock history is this, and also this. So maybe what you can do is explore the double standards in media, what we hold female musicians to and what we hold male musicians to, and potentially, bring in some other pieces, talk about how much certain artists might get paid in regards to other artists, think about the standards of beauty or fashion that come with female and male artists, and then maybe potentially have that culminate in a Socratic seminar, but bringing and keeping Phoebe Bridgers and that SNL performance and the ultimate response at the center of it all. All right, so option number 2 is basically going to be track analysis and comparison. First song that's actually a song on the album is Garden Song, which is basically a dreamlike reflective state in which Bridgers talks about growing up, realizing that she's growing up, and reminiscing a little bit about where she grew up. What I would bring in there is Arcade Fire's The Suburbs, which is the title track off that album. I would have students compare where there's similarities, if anything, just in certain lyrics, and see what both songs are doing similarly. And maybe also have them kind of craft their own responses about what they might reminisce about when they leave wherever they've grown up. The title track off Punisher discusses this idea of imposter syndrome and who you are not matching up with the person that you idolize. Maybe not being the person that you need to be when you meet someone that you idolize. Someone who Bridgers idolizes is Elliott Smith, who's passed. But what I might do is have those two artists kind of go head to head. Bring a track from Elliott Smith, maybe Waltz number 2, and compare that to Punisher and see how those two fit together. Where are they similarly doing things? Where are the inspirations that you can see from Smith to Bridgers in her work? Think about those things. Now, I Know the End, which is the final track of the album, is something that Bridgers has said is similar to My Chemical Romance's Welcome to the Black Parade, which is an amazing song. She's compared I Know the End to Welcome to the Black Parade as similar in genre. So what I might have students do is listen to both of those songs and try and define what the genre of that song is, what type of song that is, either coming up with their own or seeing where it fits in with something else. In terms of other tracks off the album, songs like Chinese Satellite, Moon Song, and I See You are so lyrically rich that I think you can have students break down what they're trying to say, analyze a lot of their lyrics, but also kind of weigh them with some of what Bridgers has said about those tracks. Most certainly considering things like death of the author, there's so much that Bridgers has said about her inspiration and her intentions with this album, right? That gets into literary analysis, criticism, and I think you can decide the potential in writing an essay, comparing a couple tracks, breaking down a track based on what the author has said, or potentially just writing a straight up review that might get published on a blog or a Google Classroom page. All right, so for option number 3, we're leaning into some creative nonfiction. Focus on the language and the construction of phrases that are present on each of those tracks on Bridgers' album and have students emulate her style of rich language and incredible vulnerability. That could potentially be touchy, but I think students, in being reflective, will seize that opportunity. But also consider that a lot of times Bridgers will obscure her true vulnerabilities in that rich language, in the lyrics that she's constructing. I'd also have maybe your students look at some other singer-songwriter albums that are particularly strong: Joni Mitchell's Blue, Fiona Apple's Fetch the Bolt Cutters, and Phoebe Bridgers' Idol, Elliott Smith's Either Or. Eventually, what you get into is an assessment of personal statements or poems or memoirs that are trying to not ape, but emulate the style that's present on this album from Bridgers. All right, with all that being said, let's really assess the concept of should you teach it? So for the question of should you teach it, I think this is a particularly tough one to consider. To tell you a little anecdote about when I brought music into my classroom in the past, I had some students look at Johnny Cash's Hurt as an exercise in analysis of tone. And we had read through the lyrics first, but then we had also listened to the track. And when the students had the track playing, they kind of giggled at it because they were kind of interpreting it as either inauthentic or just merely country music, which they did not vibe with. So really, as you're considering, should you teach it, think about if this is something that will resonate with your students. You should at some point know a little bit about them, their musical interests, and based on what you know about them, this might be a great fit or this might fall a little bit flat. There are also some mentions of sex and allusions to drug use, so I would consider that for the potential age range of your students. Maybe that's not necessarily appropriate, but I think largely the grade range for this should be juniors and seniors in high school. The great thing about an album is that you can cherry pick songs, right? You can take a couple of tracks that you think are appropriate and work best off that album and bring that to your students. That's a great opportunity with any album, is Sometimes the thing works wholly on as a concept album, or with every single track, or sometimes you can just bring in one track to your students and have them work with that. Also, I would consider scaffolding. There's a lot of information and a lot of interviews that are available in terms of what Bridgers is going for, what she thinks the song means to her. So consider that as you're bringing that to your students, where you might have a track that's a little bit more difficult to decode. Definitely using something like that is going to be important, and also build out the comprehension for your students. Ultimately, my assessment leans somewhere in the looking at the parts rather than the whole. So instead of studying this album as a complete text, I would maybe lean into picking out tracks or focusing on particular lyrics or phrasing. And my favorite of the options is definitely the creative nonfiction, because you're letting students lean into reflection and also creativity, which is never a bad thing. All right, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this episode and seeing how potentially you could bring this album into your classroom. Again, I want to remind you all that I am incredibly grateful for the response to the launch of this channel and our first episode on WandaVision. In the future, when you're using Punisher in your classrooms, please be sure to update me and let me know how it goes and potentially what changes you made to what I laid out. On the internets, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe this channel and this video. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at Mr. Adam Abort. I'm also on Instagram, freshly at Can I Teach It? So follow me there for just kind of previews of upcoming episodes. But with that, until next time, happy teaching.